a UFO crashing into a windmill, and a public funeral for the poor, unfortunate extraterrestrial pilot. That's what we're talking about today. Welcome to Old Fashioned UFOs. Shane Hurd here. Today, Jason McClellan and I are having a casual discussion about the 1897 Aurora, Texas UFO crash. Now, just like a bourbon cocktail classic such as the Old Fashioned endures the test of time, well, so too the classic Old Fashioned UFO cases stand the test of time. Whether it be the photographic evidence, physical evidence, the strength of eyewitness testimony, or government documentation, these cases are worthy of their classic status and deserve our attention. So sit back with your beverage of choice and follow along as we discuss our favorite subject, UFOs. But first, Jason, what bourbon are you drinking and what's your recipe for a good old-fashioned?
Oh boy. Well, I don't think there could be a bad old fashioned. Old fashions are just, by definition, they're really good. One of my favorite cocktails for sure. And I mix it up all the time. What alcohol I use in it. Today I'm drinking a rye, Dickel rye.
Ooh.
So that's what I've got in my old fashioned. But I really like experimenting with different bitters too in the old fashioned. So just starting from the beginning, I'll do a sugar cube, sprinkle that with some bitters, smash that baby up. A little splash of water too helps dissolve the sugar a little bit. Then my bourbon or my rye or my whiskey, and then gotta have a good volume of ice in there. I like a good ice sphere or a large ice cube, as opposed to multiple ice cubes, small ice cubes, or ice shaving chips. It's always bad news when you order one in a restaurant and they bring you all the ice chips. That's not a good old fashioned. But then a slice of orange, the orange rind, that spritz of citrus, really sets it off. And then you've got to have a good brandied cherry. None of the maraschino cherry crap. You've got to have a good brandied cherry for a real old fashioned. So that's what I do. And, lately with the bitters, I've been doing cherry bitters in my old fashions.
Ooh.
So, yeah.
Ooh,
That's
I'll
what
have
I've
to try
got.
that. Nice. Looks
What about
good.
you? What's your bourbon today?
Well, I went with a little bit of a treat. A friend of mine got me a bottle of, let's see if you can see it here.
Oh, I love Four Roses.
Yes, and it's single barrel. Oh my goodness.
That's awesome.
Smooth as butter. So that's what I used today. I too did a tablespoon this time of sugar. I did like a half ounce of hot water, knocked that down, melted it, dropped in my, I can't pronounce it. Is it Angalora's bitter or whatever it is? Starts with
Angostura. Yeah.
Angostura. And then I did not have a black cherry this time or an orange, so I'm going pretty light with no garnishment. But, sometimes you get the Cadillac version and sometimes you don't. But I too have the big old ice sphere.
There you
and
go.
If anyone has a chance, you can buy those molds.
Yep.
And you have all sorts of different shapes. I got one of the moon. I've got a couple skull heads. I even have one of the Death Star from Star Wars. And so those are all fun and cool and just add to it. So yeah,
I've really been on the hunt for UFO spheres. And I think I've seen some molds, but they're kind of tiny. I would like a larger flying saucer. If you could have like a large flying saucer in ice for your old fashioned, that would be amazing.
That'd be sweet.
Yeah.
That or a big alien head too.
Yeah.
Either one of those.
Yeah, some
But
of those
we'll see,
skulls are like alien heads, but even
they're
the skull
close.
ones don't come out right all the time. But
yeah.
Hey.
Yeah, kind of a little too much detail, but
it's all fun.
Still fun.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, cheers.
Yeah, cheers to you too. And, it's 5 o'clock somewhere.
Well, it's always 5 o'clock on old-fashioned UFOs.
That's right. Well, now that we're all settled in with a good drink, let's talk UFOs.
Yeah.
And let me start off with a summary of that 1897 Aurora, Texas case. So, it reportedly occurred on April 17th of that year in Aurora, Texas, and this is a small town sort of in the northwest corner of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex area. And that incident reportedly resulted in a fatality from the pilot of that crash. And the alleged alien body is reportedly buried in an unmarked grave at the local cemetery. And I wanted to share with you just an article that was written just 2 days later. And let me bring that up. And it's a little hard for me to read because it's kind of a copy of the actual newspaper print. But here we go. So this is by a guy by the name of S.E. Hayden, a resident of Aurora, Texas. But he was writing the article for the Dallas Herald News. And it goes like this. About 6 o'clock this morning, the early risers of Aurora were astonished at the sudden appearance of the airship which has been sailing through the country. It was traveling due north and much nearer the earth than ever before. Evidently, some of the machinery was out of order, for it was making a speed of only 10 or 12 miles an hour and gradually settling toward the earth. It sailed directly over the public square, and when it reached the north part of town, it collided with the tower of Judge Proctor's windmill and went to pieces with a terrific explosion, scattering debris over several acres of ground, wrecking the windmill and water tank, and destroying the judge's lower garden. The pilot of the ship is supposed to have been the only one on board, and while his remains are badly disfigured, enough of the original has been picked up to show that he was not an inhabitant of this world. Mr. T.J. Wema, the United States Signal Service officer at this place and an authority on astronomy, gives it as his opinion that he was a native of the planet Mars. Papers found on his person, evidently the record of his travels, are written in some unknown hieroglyphics and cannot be deciphered. The ship was too badly wrecked to form any conclusion as to its construction or motive power. It was built of an unknown metal, resembling somewhat a mixture of aluminum and silver, and it must have weighed several tons. The town is full of people today who are viewing the wreck and gathering specimens of the strange metal from the debris. The pilot's funeral will take place at noon tomorrow. Again by S.E. Hayden. Well, that kind of sums up the case there, but there were other key points that began to be discovered later. Did you want to share some of those?
Yeah, sure. So there was reportedly wreckage from this crash site that was dumped into a nearby well. It was located under the damaged windmill, which and some of the debris wound up in the gravesite of this poor deceased alien pilot as well. According to the mystery, Brawley Oates, who purchased Judge Proctor's property in 1945, allegedly cleaned out the debris from that well placed by the judge in order to use it as a water source. He actually wanted to use the well on the property. But poor guy later developed arthritis, and he attributed that to the metal that was in the well. So he thought the water had been contaminated by this metal. So in 1957, he sealed up the well with concrete, poured a concrete slab over it, and also built an outbuilding on top of it, and obviously stopped using that water source.
Yeah, pretty crazy. And I know I've seen photos or video of him when he was alive, and that arthritis was wicked on his hands. They were just, not even usable or barely usable. So that was a pretty frightening thing. So, yeah, all right. Well, that's interesting, and that is information that's come out. I know there were several investigations, and in fact, one of them was conducted by a local Dallas television station. Did you pick up on that one at all?
Yeah, so the incident has certainly been investigated on numerous occasions, and one was broadcast by a local television station, KDFW Fox 4, and two other notable ones were done by cable networks. So the KDFW report, they did a lengthy sort of investigative report on Aurora in 1998. And the reporter who did this was, his name was Richard Ray, and he interviewed former Fort Worth Star Telegram reporter Jim Mars, who UFO researchers are probably familiar with that name. And they also interviewed other locals too. And they said something crashed in Aurora, but Ray's report was unable to conclusively find evidence of extraterrestrial life or extraterrestrial technology. Ray reported that the state of Texas had even erected a historical plaque. I love how they covered that, this cool plaque that's in town that outlines the whole Aurora incident, but they label it as a legend, and Aurora certainly is a legend.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can appreciate that. I mean, there is no physical evidence, and it's a great story, and it's a little town, and it's cool that they at least embraced it to that degree to put up a plaque. And even though saying it's a legend, it's still a pretty cool little thing to have.
It is, and much like Roswell, New Mexico, Aurora seems to have fully embraced the Aurora incident, because all you have to do is look on the city's website, the city's official website, and you will definitely find information about this case on that website. You will also find that the city's logo is a windmill and a flying saucer in the air. It's really cool.
That's awesome that they would do that.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
And we mentioned Jim Mars in that story too, in the report done by the news. And Jim actually did his own documentary on the Aurora incident. So for people interested, that's a cool thing to watch too.
Yeah, it is. And Jim was just so great, wasn't he? He just, he could tell a story, man.
I miss Jim Mars. That guy he was a character. He really was. You could always go to any UFO conference and see that hat. You knew Jim Mars was in the building.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, then, we mentioned there are several investigations. One I was kind of interested in is, do you remember the old UFO TV show, UFO Files?
UFO Files was so good. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, really more mainstream UFO programs, and they tackled everything. I mean, it was really good. But
yeah.
this was a case that they had done, and in fact, it was on December 2nd, 2005 that they first aired an episode related to this incident, and it was entitled "The Texas Roswell," kind of like you mentioned. And what they had done is they had featured a 1973 investigation that occurred by a gentleman by the name of Bill Case, and he was actually an aviation writer for that very same newspaper, the Dallas Times-Herald. But what was interesting, especially to me, is that Bill was actually the Texas state director of MUFON at the time, the Mutual UFO Network. And so they, it was sort of a part of, a MUFON investigation, as well as, Ted himself.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is they uncovered two nearly eyewitnesses to the crash. The first was a young girl by the name of Mary Evans, and she was 15 years old at the time. And she told of how her parents went to the crash site because they forbade her for going, and the discovery of this alien body. And Charlie Stevens, who was about age 10, told how he actually saw the airship flying, through the sky. It was trailing some smoke, kind of headed north towards Aurora. Their ranch was outside of town a bit. And so he saw this thing, and he wanted to go check it out. His dad said, no, you got to finish your chores, which is so
practical.
It's so practical. It cracks me up. Oh, there's a UFO from, an alien from another place.
You can't see the UFO until you eat your dinner. Yeah.
That's right. Or,
take out the garbage
or whatever his chores were. Yeah. Cracks me up. But at any rate, his parents did go to town the next day, and allegedly they saw the actual wreckage or some of the debris from whatever it was that crashed. Then MUFON also investigated the Aurora Cemetery, and they did in fact uncover a grave marker that appeared to show a flying saucer of some sort, as well as they had readings from a metal detector, because part of the legend is that some of the debris was buried with the alien, in addition to what got put into the well. So they asked for permission to exhume the site, but the Cemetery Association declined permission to do that. And shortly after they conducted their investigation, and it made known that they found these things, the marker mysteriously disappeared from the cemetery, although somebody had driven like a small pipe into the ground where it was at. So I don't know if they wanted to take attention away from this or whatever. But interestingly, the metal detector didn't pick up any more metal after that had happened. So that's kind of a weird thing. I'm not sure what's going on there. But they're presuming stuff got removed, but you would think you would see evidence of it being dug up. But whatever. I don't have that level of detail at this point. But MUFON's report eventually stated that the evidence was just inconclusive, and the episode featured an interview with the mayor at that time. Her last name was Brammer, and she discussed kind of the town's tragic history and some of her thoughts on what had happened way back when.
Yeah.
But imagine that, a UFO case without conclusive evidence.
Right. And again, just to bring it up again, we're talking about a case from 1897. That is just a little bit ago. So imagine how old people are who, when this investigation was actually taking place, how old the even second-hand witnesses were at the time. I mean, it is nearly impossible with a case like this to get any worthwhile support for the story. I mean, a large portion of this entire story hinges on a newspaper article that was published at the time. Any subsequent witness testimony is, second, third hand testimony coming from, children or grandchildren of people who were in the area at the time and saying, oh yeah, I remember my parents telling me about this, or my grandparents telling me about this. So it's really hard to track that down and have it be very weighty in terms of considering the evidence.
Yeah, and it's a shame that, that is the case. But this is a good reason why we're doing what we're doing. It doesn't mean that the case, it doesn't mean that it didn't happen just because it's old, or, there's some documentation, there's some, testimony, and these investigations really kind of link it, and keep it alive throughout history. And I know that doesn't necessarily add any credibility to the original incident happening or not, but at least, the details, the data, and the history is being carried forward. And this is one of the reasons we talked about this being one of our first old-fashioned UFO cases. It is definitely old, but it's not so old that there's no documentation. So there's some stuff with it, and so it's still worth considering.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we point out, there is still value in going back and looking at these cases and re-looking at these cases, because with the video, the video projects that we pointed out, the investigations behind those did yield some interesting results. And certainly UFO Hunters was another one that in 2008, in late 2008, they did a television documentary titled First Contact about the Aurora incident. And it featured a notable change from the UFO Files story. And that is the introduction of Tim Oates, the nephew of Brawley Oates, and the now owner of the property with the sealed well where the UFO wreckage was allegedly buried. And he allowed investigators to unseal the well so they could examine it for possible debris. I mean, that's huge, pestering and pestering. Yeah. Everybody wanted to do that, but they finally made it happen. And so they did water samples from the well. which mostly tested normal, except for large amounts of aluminum present. So, I mean, there were no like significant contents, in terms of metal or anything like that taken from the well. But, it was stated in the episode that any large pieces of metal had been removed from the well by a past owner, which we certainly knew. And then, there came into question, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but, there came into question about there even being a windmill on the property. But, through this investigation, they determined that, there was, or at least a base of it, so.
Yeah. No, I thought that was an excellent investigation. That's the one that sticks in my mind. I remember the episode where, the property had like a 6-foot chain link fence all around it, and literally 3 feet over the fence line was that little, it almost looked like an outhouse, but that small little building there on top of that slab. I mean, it was tantalizingly close. They weren't allowed to go in or do anything, and you could almost reach out and touch it, and they were just like, if we could only look in there, we could solve it. Eventually, they got that cooperation and were able to get in there and look at it. So I thought that was pretty cool.
And, again, I mean, that thing that's impossible to not want to further examine, the cemetery, I mean, they pushed that too on that show, and the Cemetery Association still wouldn't permit anything to be exhumed. They used ground penetrating radar, and I love investigations that use GPR. So they were able to do that, and although the grave was unmarked, they were still able to sort of identify that in that area, evidence points to there being a grave there, although tiny grave, so a smaller than normal grave. They were able to determine was actually there where it's supposed to be. So that was an interesting find.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, just like so many cases, there's evidence. It varies in terms of what type it is and its level of credibility, but there's evidence that something happened there. There's no question about it. And Judge Proctor's windmill got creamed out by something. So, and in 1897, you don't have a lot of choices there. But as great as that UFO hunters investigation is, there was still that little doubt that people had, and the hoax and that kind of thing. And I was just going to comment a little bit on that hoax theory. And again, as a MUFON investigator, you always have to consider hoax as a possibility. But interestingly, it's only a small percentage of cases really are directly attributable to hoax. But it is something you got to consider. And so in this case, remember I mentioned that mayor at the time, she was involved in one of those stories. Her name was Barbara Brammer, and she was a former mayor of Aurora. And she began to research this, and this was part of that UFO Files episodes. That was the earlier one. And she had indicated that in the months prior to that alleged crash, that Aurora had been beset by a series of tragic incidents. So, and remember, today, these small little communities and stuff, they were living by a thread, and people were hanging on, and, you just didn't have the kind of, government support or big corporate support that maybe, keeps things moving today. And so they were, pretty sensitive to big changes. And so first thing that happened to them was the local cotton crop, which was the major source of revenue for that town. It was destroyed by a boll weevil infestation, and that we know that was something that was very prominent back in the day, and it was a severe risk. And then secondly, a fire on the town's west side claimed several buildings and lives, and shortly after the fire, a spotted fever epidemic hit the town, nearly wiping out the remaining citizens and actually placed that whole town under quarantine. So yeah, they were really taking it on the chin. And then finally, there was supposed to be a railroad to go through the town, which we all know that can be a lifeblood of these smaller communities. But it never made it to the town. It was, rerouted like 20 miles away. And so that was kind of like, a heart and the stake of the poor little town, not being able to get the railroad to go through there.
Yeah.
But essentially, Aurora, which claimed nearly 3,000 residents at that time, was in serious danger of dying out. And Brammer's research also showed that guy who wrote the article, that S.E. Hayden, he was known in the town to be a bit of a jokester.
Yeah.
And her conclusion is that Hayden's article was kind of a last-ditch attempt to keep Aurora alive. And I mean, that's not a crazy theory, because we know a lot of little towns really thrive off their legends and myths and continue to be, like a tourist destination because of those things. So,
yeah.
I mean, it's not out of the question that could have been the case. And it was further supported by the fact that he never performed any kind of follow-up to that story, not even to report on the aliens' burial, which I think the last line of that report said that, the funeral's in 2 days or whatever it was. And you would think that would be a even bigger story than the crash.
Town
right?
turns out for an alien's funeral. Yes, I would go to that funeral.
Yeah, I think so, and I would even, bring my old fashioned with me and and enjoy that.
Yeah, no, there conveniently was no follow up there, and it's also interesting pointing out that I think that actually goes to support the idea that it wasn't like some sort of effort to generate tourism or anything to save the town. It just sounds like, if that is the argument, it just sounds like a funny guy, being goofy and writing a goofy story just to be silly and get some laughs because he thought that was great fun. But, because there was no follow-up, because there isn't any record of trying to capitalize on, come see the alien grave or come see where a UFO crashed. It just kind of died with him. It seemed like he was a lone wolf in that. It was his own little game that he wanted to do, if that was what it was. Mm-hmm. It doesn't seem like it was any effort on the part of the town to help keep it alive.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with you there. If that was really the intent, the real opportunity came later.
Yes,
like you said, to really drive interest and so forth. So, yeah, I think that's certainly a possibility, or and maybe it was an exaggeration, or maybe we'll talk more about it. You're going to talk more about it, but at the time there was some interesting things going on across the country that would certainly generate some kind of interest there. And I'll just say it on the outset, as with every UFO case, an investigator must consider the possibility of misidentification.
Yes.
In fact, in my mind, my experience as a MUFON investigator, I'm in the maybe 85% range of cases that are reported are actually misidentifications of something more prosaic.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because you did mention that the very small percentage of hoaxes, UFO cases, a very small percentage are actual deliberate hoaxes. But yes, the large majority are just misidentifications.
Yeah, and when you think about it, today we have a ton of stuff out there, right? We've got
much
airplanes and helicopters and missiles and rockets and satellites and drones. And then, of course, then all the prosaic stuff, the natural things, Aurora Borealis or ball lightning or, planet Venus, or there are a lot of things that, when, depending on the context of your situation, either you've never seen them or you rarely see them, or you don't see them in the context of what you're experiencing at that moment. And so something prosaic can look really weird. So, I don't criticize anyone, because some of the brightest minds in the world have made misidentifications, scientists and military and all. So it's not a criticism of the observer's ability. It's just, the circumstances
being human.
Can make it. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the big issues, though, in 1897, it's not like you had airplanes, helicopters, missiles, rockets, satellites, or drones. So you're going to touch on something, though, that could have been a misidentification.
Yeah, you're right. So at that point in time, anything in the sky was likely something, mysterious and, something that other people hadn't seen, because there wasn't really anything in the sky. There was a flap of sorts during that time period, 1896, 1897, of these mystery airships across the country, and even across the world. And they were never really resolved or explained. People reported strange airships and even encounters with the occupants of these airships. Even interesting ones, like kids playing in a field and seeing one of these things drift over and like claiming to hear conversations of the occupants piloting these things. Yeah, I mean, these reports came from coast to coast here in the U.S. and certainly all across the world. And there are lots of newspaper reports of these mysterious sightings. There were, unusual lights associated with these things. Cigar shape was commonly reported with a lot of these airships. Very, very similar to dirigibles in their appearance, a lot of them. Pilots reported as human-looking, but not quite. And many reports of these pilots being from Mars. And, we certainly saw that in the Aurora case, which was kind of silly in how that was presented. But, that was not uncommon at the time. Mars was very much a pop culture thing, and aliens from Mars. But, people try to explain the airship thing as possibly being, some rich inventor experimenting with some sort of air travel. And people like to poo-poo that, saying that, if somebody was doing that, it would have been public knowledge. Everybody would have been on top of that. But that's not really the case. News traveled very slowly back then. People relied on newspapers, and primarily their local newspapers. So they were familiar with the news that was taking place in their local town, and, big stories they would hear about. But even in Aurora around that time, there were lots of other sightings like this that were taking place, that were being reported in the local media. But, although it was uncommon and people were unfamiliar with this stuff, there were airships in the skies during that time. There were rich, crazy, awesome inventors testing this stuff. There were certainly craft that could do very short flights, but there were craft being tested at that time that were able to do longer flights. Certainly kind of matching the description of some of these crafts, and certainly in Aurora, they talked about something must have been wrong with its engine because it was only going like 10 miles an hour or something through the sky. That sounds a little bit like a dirigible or some type of blimp. A lot of these sightings too reported things like propellers as the propulsion mechanism on these ships. But again, that also could play into what you're familiar with, right? Because we equate things to what we know. We look at mysterious things and try to put our familiarity onto those to make them make sense to us. So who knows if they actually did have propeller propulsion. But those are some of the things that were reported. But although it was limited at that time, there certainly were conventional craft in the sky.
Yeah, I was fascinated to discover that actually ballooning had started about 100 years before that.
Isn't that insane? That is so insane to think about.
Like, I think one account I read, like, for in the Civil War. No, that's 1860. No, in the 1700s, there was an attempt to. Well, I think that's when they first started developing balloons, and they were the, quote, hot air balloons.
Yeah.
That's what they used. But they found that only lasted like 15 minutes or something. And then they finally achieved the technology of using gas like helium or hydrogen to propel these balloons, and then it enabled them to go further. And there was an attempt to go to the North Pole by, I think, a Swedish guy. And, they didn't make it, but again, late 1700s, attempting to go to the North Pole in a balloon. Oh my gosh, So, yeah, you can readily imagine that this technology was spreading earth-wide. Different people were making different efforts, and there has to be, in my mind anyway, Jason, I don't know how you feel about this, but for there to be multiple reports across the country and across the world of these so-called airships, there still has to be some explanation for that, right? It isn't, as you said, an event might occur, and it would take a couple weeks for that event to get spread around to the other newspapers and stuff in the country. So, like, I know San Francisco was an area that had multiple sightings. But, it might take 2 weeks for the East Coast to even hear about it, right? So it's not like today you have the internet and you have cable news and blah, 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 and you have instantaneous sharing of information. It would take weeks. So if you're of the opinion that, one person made a mistake or a misidentification and got reported, and then everybody else just picked up on that same report, and because it was just so ubiquitous and easy to dispense. No,
right.
That story, even to get that story from San Francisco to another city, say Denver, I mean, somebody probably had to get on a train or a horse or whatever and take that information there. Now, maybe there's telegraph at that time. I'm sorry, I'm not sure on my history there, but there wasn't teletype, there wasn't email, there was, what I mean? So there has to be some explanation for this thing, and I equate that to even like today with UFO reports, or when you're getting thousands of reports on something, it can't all be a hoax. It can't all be a misidentification. There has to be some actual reality that's triggering this, even if it's misinterpreted or exaggerated or whatever. You know what I'm saying? So that's kind of my feeling on it.
Right. And I think there's, again, talking about percentages, I think the percentage of the mass effect is pretty small. We hear that with UFO sighting statistics every year, with, the summertime bump, with it being related to summer blockbusters, people seeing UFO movies, UFO related movies, and then there being an uptick in UFO sightings because people just saw the latest UFO blockbuster and now they're seeing UFOs everywhere. I mean, yes, there is a percentage of that does actually happen, but to say it's substantial, I think, is ridiculous. Yeah, and certainly back during a time when news traveled slow, and that's if people even were aware of news happening other places. They were familiar with what was happening in their town, what was happening with their immediate family, and what they were hearing locally. And there was certainly a buzz across the country as well as other countries during that time. So there was stuff in the air for sure.
Yeah. Well, that's so cool. I love this idea of these old-fashioned UFOs and these cases, and partly because it's just part of the history of UFOs, and that's neat and interesting in itself. But I still think that there's value to these cases, and in terms of what you investigate and how you go about that investigation. And even with this one, we've seen how it matured over the decades, right? So you had the guy that writes the little article the first day, boom, that's it. But then you have all this nexus of cemetery and the mayor and the town and Judge Proctor and all that, and then there are discoveries made, that there was in fact a windmill. Yes, debris actually got put into the well. The well was closed up. The well was opened up later. I mean, all these things are still really fascinating and interesting aspects of investigation and research into UFOs. And I think it does teach us something. I mean, I still look at those UFO Hunter episodes, and I absolutely love the way they investigated. I think it was highly effective in terms of investigative, but also in terms of the entertainment value and the communication value to make those things known to the public. So, and there's just great value in all that. So I love it, and I I do like this case, and it's in my gray basket. I mean, I think likely it's probably not what we think it is, or but who knows, right? It's still part of the record.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything you said. I think as far as the value with what you can glean from looking back at the investigation process of this case and the various elements that can come from that, and what witness testimony looks like, generationally. Just so many fascinating things from an investigative standpoint with this case. And then, I love towns. We mentioned Roswell, and they've kind of flip-flopped over the years, but, towns that take this and just run with it. They embrace it, make it part of their identity, and, that I think helps to really encourage people to become interested and do a little digging on their own. Because otherwise they might not have heard about Aurora, Texas. They might not have heard about the Aurora, Texas UFO incident. When they even look at the UFO logo and see that, or the city logo and see the UFO on it, they might do a little digging and say, why is there a UFO on a city logo? And then find their legendary case and start looking into it. Realize that there have been documentaries made about this. There have been books written about this. There have been investigations done into this. So it kind of opens the door to tumble down and do some independent research and get interested and become aware of other cases too.
Yep, very cool. So great for people newly interested in this, and even great for folks who have been at it a long time. So
I even love how the town,
cool.
and I don't know how they came to this. I mean, maybe I need to do some more research, but they even have a name for the poor little pilot who they claim to have buried. His name is Ned.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, Ned the alien. So
love it.
Yeah, they've got the whole history there, so that's great. For me, yeah, I mean it's grayish for me as well on this case. I can't. It's hard to just nail down and say, I think this is a real case, or I think this is a hoax case, because there's so many different elements going on here. Like we pointed out with the article, most of this is based just on a newspaper article. We don't know the motives behind the guy. We know he was a jokester. That's how he was known by people who knew him. But in the article itself, there are plenty of things that are very jokey, that seem kind of silly to throw in such a kind of shocking article about a UFO crashing and a extraterrestrial having a funeral. But, the pointing out that the UFO destroyed the judge's flower garden, and that they talked to some guy who knew astronomy and could claim that this guy was from the pilot was from Mars. I mean, that's just ridiculous. So, I mean, there are lots of things in there that are just kind of laughable. But we do have evidence that something did, in fact, crash there on the property and destroyed the windmill or water tank or sump pump or whatever it was. Something was destroyed there. There was remains of a wreck of some kind. Bring into it the cemetery. Something was buried. It's all very strange and not so easily dismissed as a non-event or simply a hoax event.
Yep, I'm so with you on that. Something happened. Now, doesn't mean it's alien, no, but something happened, right?
And we'll never know what that was.
Yeah, yep. But it's just a great part of the lore, and still fascinating.
The frustrating and amazing thing about those old-fashioned UFO cases.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that concludes our discussion of the old-fashioned case of the 1897 Aurora, Texas UFO crash. But next time, we're going to be discussing what is considered by many to be the beginning of the modern UFO era, the Kenneth Arnold sighting in June of 1947. So, join us with your favorite beverage, and also hear about the origin of the term flying saucer. All right. Well, we'll see you next time. Cheers, buddy.
Cheers.